Hello and welcome to the 6th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. In this series I talk about the 10 cards with the most competitive success in Eternal's history that fulfill a certain condition. In this case they have to be a free faction card. For that I compiled a list of all decks that topped an official Direwolf event or reached top 8 in the ETS seasons of 2017 and 18. The ranking is then based on a point system. Each tier 1 top grants 2 points and each tier 2 top grants 1. The tiers are either based on how far the deck went or on how important the event was. For a more detailed explanation, check out the introduction video on my channel. Usually I take all data from 2017 to 2022 into account, but this is the first seasonal episode, which means I will only use tournament results from one specific season, in this case 2022. With the release of the new free faction focused set called Battle Lines, I thought it would be fun to look at how free faction cards fared in competitive tournaments in the past, in this case specifically 2022. Since the release of set 9 Arch and Devs, Throne was consistently dominated by 2 faction decks because the advantage of consistent power bases that enabled powerful influence payoffs was just too good to pass upon. There have been some outliers though, decks that just got too much from going into a 3rd or even 4th and 5th faction. For example, FTS and 5-faction even Vox decks in mid-2020 and FPS Trove decks in early 2021. In this video I will take a deep dive into the outliers of the 2022 season, which, spoiler warning, are a pretty small group, but some of them had a big impact on that season nevertheless. As always, feel free to write your guesses about which cards you expect to see on top, or your questions about how close some cards that you expected to see missed out in the comments. And with that, let's begin. We start with 3 cards that share rank 10 with just 2 points each. The first of them is Display of Vision. It's a 3 power, 1-time, Justice and Shadow Influence uncommon fast spell that is part of a cycle of 10 displays that all have 3 different effects from which you can choose one. In this case you can give all enemy units -1/-1 this turn, play a power card of your choice from your deck, or kill an attachment on an enemy. Display of Vision had a lot of success in the 2020 season, but faded out in 2021 and only had 2 tops in Throne in 2022, both at 4 copies in TGS midrange. The card itself was very well positioned into a meta full of relics, most importantly Dinosaur Nest and the Creation Project, but most players preferred to play Xenon if they wanted to play grindy midrange decks with tools to beat Project, so Display couldn't get more than those 2 points. From a card that was good against Project, we come to a card that was occasionally played in Project decks, Vulk the Autoforge. Vulk is a 3 power, 1 fire, time and justice influence, 5/3 legendary unit with overwhelm and endurance. And when it dies, it plays a 3 power relic called Vulk's Heart that it can replay Vulk from the Void with +2/+2 stats if you pay 3 power and sacrifice the heart plus an additional relic. Vulk saw experimentation in one specific variant of Project decks, the Suppressor variant. That deck played Grand Suppressor and Dean's Chamber to counter a sizable chunk of units in the format, for example Aurelian Supplier or All Merchants. Those 2 cards also countered a lot of ways to interact with your project, for example Sabertooth Bright Leader, Warbook or Reappropriator. Playing them made your own cards with summon effects weaker too though, so people decided to cut cards like Aurelian Supplier or Warbook from their project decks, which meant they had room for alternatives like Vulk, and for suppressor payoffs like Belux or Snapping Hydrangea. But in the end that variant only made up a small fraction of project decks, and of that small fraction only 2 played Vulk, which is only enough for a shared 10th spot. The last card in that shared 10th spot is Summoner 7. He's a 3 power, 1 fire, time and primal influence 2/2 legendary unit, and when he attacks you can play a unit from your hand for free. That is a very powerful effect and people were excited to build combo decks around it when he was released towards the end of the 2022 season, but those decks turned out to be too fragile and inconsistent. In the end 7 only had 2 tops. The first was as a 4-off in an expedition deck that was basically a fair FTP midrange deck, with some bigger units that 7 could occasionally cheat out, like Sashenka of Kozul or Koriox All-Seeing. The second top was in a dedicated combo deck in Throne that played 7 in the market with 12 ways to draw him from there, including Speedcrafter, which could give 7 charge to immediately get an effect on the turn you play 7. It also played Battlefront Dasher and Warhelm to have more options to give your 7 charge, and it had access to bigger units than the Expedition version, most importantly Kairos Grand Champion and Scourge of Frostholm. Next up we have Brill, Soulless Apostate. She's a 6 power double fire, justice and shadow influence 4/5 legendary unit with Warcry 2, and on summon she either plays a 4/4 relic weapon with Warcry 2 or she grants your current relic weapon the same stats and battle skill. Brill was widely played when she came out back in late 2018, but with the fall of FGS midrange she fell out of favor over the years. But FGS made a comeback in 2022 thanks to the release of Black Book Pit Boss in Z13, who used to have endurance, and the big buff to Dichro Conqueror from 6 to 4 power in late 2021. Brill was buffed as well in 2021 from 7 power down to 6, which made her an attractive market choice for the FGS midrange decks that saw widespread play in early 2022, but she was only played in about 1/3 of them. All lists that played her also played 4 copies of Furious Magniventris, who used to be a 3/5, and 2 copies of Stonebreaker Bow, which used to buff itself permanently if you used the contract ability, for some extra relic weapon synergy. On rank 7 we have the Cargos, or more specifically Vinch's Cargo. All Cargos are 1 power rare spells that can draw 1 of 3 specific sigils, but they transmute into their respective contraband once you reach 2 influence in all their 3 factions. The contrabands are also 1 power spells, and they show you a random card from each of their factions, out of which you choose 1 to create and draw. That means Cargos are side grade to Seek power for the 5 faction pairs that have them. They are better in the sense that you can get some non-power cards if you already have enough power, but on the flip side the transmute is automatic, so sometimes they will transmute early because you had a lot of dual faction powers, and then they can't draw you more power if you would need it. Team Ranksters still preferred them over Seek power in their version of FGS midrange, which makes up most of the 8 tops that Vinch's Cargo had in 2022. Their list did top out at 5 power, and the Cargo would rarely transmute before that, so it was a consistent way to get more power in the early game, and after that it was a lot better than Seek power, because a choice of 3 cards meant that you could get something that's more impactful than just a normal sigil most of the time. From the other 4 Cargos, only Ixton managed to top an event. It was played in the Condemn market of a single FGPS Overloader combo list, which made sense because it could provide fixing for the 3 influences that you could possibly still be missing if you already had a Shadow influence for Condemn. And next up we have the better version of Cargos, Chants, specifically Creation Chant. Chants are 1 power rare spells that, like Cargos, can draw 1 of 3 specific sigils. They can also draw non-power cards if they have 2 influence in all 3 of their factions, but contrary to Cargos, they don't transmute, so you can still use them to draw a sigil in the late game. Instead of transmuting, you can decimate to invoke, which means you give up 1 permanent power, and then you get a choice between a unit, a spell and an attachment, each from one of the 3 respective factions. If you use that effect, you still get to draw a sigil, which means Chants can draw 2 cards if you have enough influence, which makes them a lot better than Cargos. The most successful chant was, unsurprisingly, Creation Chant, because it was in the factions of the Creation Project. It was mostly played in the ICQ A Risky Investment in August 2022, so before Project got nerfed from 3 to 4 power, but Team Rankster also played 2 copies of it in the ICQ The Long Path right after that nerf. Both iterations didn't play other ways to get power outside of a single card with Inscribe in the market, and in a few earlier and most later iterations 4 copies of Naoki, Valiant Warrior. But Pledge is pretty unreliable at getting your power, and the Inscribe cards couldn't always fix your influence and were reliant on you already having the influence for your market access card, which made the Chants an attractive addition, especially because they also had synergy with Alessi Compre Archmage. Despite all that, Creation Chant showed up in only 12% of Creation Project decks, because most players preferred other ways to consistently get a 3rd or 4th power. Like Cargos, only 1 other chant made some points. In this case it was Tradition Chant. It was played in TGP Acro, also named ABCDEF, based on the initials of some cards in it. A deck that had a very similar approach to earlier FGJ Project decks, in the sense that it was an aggressive 3-faction aggro deck with a lot of individual strong cards that also had some synergy, but it ended up being the weaker version in the long run because Project itself just had too much raw power. We make a small jump in points to rank 5, Vikram's Bomb. It's a 3 power, 1 fire, time and shadow influence promo spell that kills an enemy unit, relic or side and deals 3 damage to the enemy if you control a hero. Vikram's Bomb got released as a promo towards the start of the 2022 season and had a solid showing throughout all Expedition tournaments that year, especially towards the end. It was mostly played in FTS midrange decks, which played all the best units in those factions, some of which were heroes incidentally, but Bomb was not reliant on having a high hero count because the removal effect mattered way more. Additionally, it saw play in aggressive FTS token decks, one of which won Worlds in the hand of Apple Chips, and in a single 5-faction midrange list. At Throne, it had a harder time because FTS decks didn't really exist, but it managed to gain 2 points in FTGS project lists as a flexible removal spell that could deal with problematic units and also kill Project in the mirror match. Next up we have the second display on this list, Display of Ambition. It's a 3 power, 1 fire, justice and shadow influence uncommon fast spell that either gives your units +1 attack and overwhelm, draws 2 units from your void and deals 2 damage to you, or that kills an enemy unit with 5 or more life. Display of Ambition was an essential part of the aforementioned FGS midrange decks in Throne. All of them played at least 2 copies of it, but most of them opted for 4 because the flexibility made it a great card to draw in most situations. The removal part could kill widely played units like Black Book Pit Boss, Tough Rod Auric Broker, or Furious Magniventress, and the Void Recursion could be used to outgrind other midrange decks in the board buff, while being a lot more situational than the other 2 effects, could help you push for game in some situations. Additionally, Display saw a little bit of play outside of FGS midrange at the start of the 2022 season in an FGPS midrange deck, and at the end in 2 FTGS project lists. For rank 3 we come back to FTJ with Naoki Valiant Warrior. She's a 5 power, double fire, time and justice influence 5/5 legendary unit with Pledge, Charge, Endurance and Exalted. Her other effects rarely come up in the decks it was played in 2022, but just for the record, when a relic goes to a void, she plays a random sigil from your deck, and on Mastery 10 she gains attack and life equal to your armor. She was in only 2 of 31 project lists in the Risky Investment ICQ, which made sense because you wanted to be able to consistently play the top card of your deck after you played Project, and with Project still at 3 power at this point, you weren't able to do that with a 5 drop on top of your deck. After the nerf of Project and some other cards that defined a more aggressive original version, she became a staple in the deck though. In the Long Path ICQ right after the nerf, she was part of half the FGR project lists and 1 FTGS project version, usually played at 4 copies. Pledge was a great way to help with the fact that the project nerf made the deck a bit more power hungry, and it also made Crack the Earth on turn 1 more consistent because you could just pledge Naoki for an undepleted time sigil and then play Crack the Earth immediately. And that meant you could also play Arc of Sol on turn 2 more often, which could allow Project on turn 3, basically as if it hadn't gotten a nerf, and it allowed you to play powerful 5 drops from your market or another Naoki on turn 4. Additionally, she was hard to deal with efficiently outside of complete board wipes thanks to her other skills. Charge meant you would get at least 1 attack in most of the time, and Exalted made removal almost pointless as long as you had at least 1 other unit on your board. On rank 2 we have another charge unit, Dicho Conqueror. He's a 4 power, 1 fire, justice and shadow influence 3/5 legendary unit with charge and flying, and when he attacks, all enemy units get -1/-1 until your next turn. He was the biggest reason to play FGS midrange instead of just Arch Import. Like Naoki, he would get at least 1 attack in against most decks, and his ability made blocking him or your other units a lot more difficult. Against decks like Koro Kira or Stone Seal, he could consistently kill units with his ability, including their namesake cards, and if they didn't have removal he made playing 1 health units almost impossible. But even against bigger units he made both blocking and racing harder, because reducing their attack meant that you wouldn't get much damage coming back. He was so strong that some project lists splashed Shadow just for him and a few removal spells like Open Contract and the aforementioned Vikram's Bomb. He was very well positioned in the project format, especially in the first ICQ with 3 power project, because those lists went wide and played a high amount of 1 health units, like Grenadine Drone, Aurelian Infestation or Initiate of the Sense. The staple status in FGS midrange at the start of the 2022 season and in 4 and 5 faction project decks towards the end of the 2022 season was enough to get a small lead on Naoki, which puts him at 2nd place. The difference in points to rank 1 is anything but small though, and of course it is the card that I already talked about throughout the whole video, the Creation Project. It's a 4 power, 1 fire, time and justice influence legendary relic that grants all your units +1/+1 in stats, and at the start of your turn the top card of your deck gets warp. And as always, if that card already had warp, it is passed down to the next card, so additional copies of Project give more cards on top of your deck warp. Project was released in the same mini-set as Summoner 7, called Enter the Arcanum, about a week before the Throne ICQ a risky investment. It was clearly the card to beat in that ICQ. At the end it was played in 34 out of the 93 decks that topped the event, with an even better conversion rate to top 8, which included 4 FTJ project lists, so half of them. It got nerfed swiftly after from 3 to 4 power, only slightly more than a month after its release, but it was one of the best cards in the next Throne ICQ, the Long Path, where it was played in 27 out of 89 decks that topped, 2 of which reached top 8, and it was still one of the best decks at Worlds, where 5 out of 16 people played it in Throne. Most of the Throne list stayed in FTJ, excluding a few outliers that I already talked about, like the FTJS versions with Dichro, Open Contract and Vikram's Bomb, and the Suppressor variant that played cards like Belax and Snapping Hydrangea. And even though they had quite a bit of difference between them, we can see a clear core in all FTJ versions that almost all lists included. Most of them played a 1 power market spell. Before the nerf, people preferred Flying Crescendo, but after both Crescendo and Project got their costs enhanced by 1, people switched to Crack Dealer for the most part. Almost all lists played Alessi, Compre Archmage, Dinosaur Nest, Power Cell and Aurelian Supplier. Those were the definite 4 core cards of the deck that defined the deck, throughout both the pre-nerf and post-nerf version. But there are a few cards that also saw a significant amount of play, both pre and post-nerf, meaning they were at least in half the decks in both iterations, and those cards include Torch, Abundance, Desert Marshal and Warburg Hand of Anarchy. The biggest difference between both iterations, next to the choice of market spell, was that people opted for a higher curve after the nerf to Project, meaning cards like Grenadine Drone or Initiate of the Sense got replaced by cards like Warburg or Naoki. While it wasn't quite as dominant as in Throne, Project also had a big impact on Expedition. In the first Expedition tournament after its release, it was already in its nerfed state, so it did cost 4 already, but it still managed to take 15 out of 83 day 2 spots. At Worlds a few months later, it made an even bigger splash. 7 out of 16 people opted to bring it in Expedition, and 3 of them reached top 4, but in the end the one who reached top 4 and didn't bring it, Apple Chips, managed to get a title with FTS tokens. Most Expedition lists were a lot less aggressive than their Throne counterparts. The slower format allowed to focus more on outgrinding the opponent, which is why a lot of people played several Unleash units like Parliament Elder, Tinker Unionist or Dune Hill Clone. They could be played early on, but also helped with winning the late game, especially in combination with Project. The complete lack of markets in the Expedition format meant that people also played Relicate in the main deck to beat other Project decks, for example Barbarian Guerrilla, who also doubles up as another Unleash unit, Waystone Igniter, who could also be used to generate more tokens to make your project better, or Dismantle, which could also be used as a power card. So you see those are all cards that have another use case except for just killing relics, which is important if you want to main deck cards like this. But similarly to Throne, where people also played relic removal on Mars, like the cards I already mentioned earlier on the Suppressor variant, it was not enough to stop the Creation Project from amassing an impressive 98 points across both formats in just a few months. You have to keep in mind it was released towards mid-August 2022, so most of the season was already done at that point. And Project still managed to get almost 100 points. This marks the end of the 6th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. You can find the introduction video and the previous episodes on my channel. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a nice week.